If you're enjoying Bradbury 100, please check out my other podcast, Science Fiction 101, in which we explore the past, present and future of science fiction. Find it at 101sf.blogspot.com. And head over to YouTube to find my Bradbury 101 series, in which I look at Ray's books and movies. This is Bradbury 100, celebrating the life and work of American writer Ray Bradbury. I'm Phil Nichols of bradburymedia.co.uk. Hello and welcome to another Bradbury 100. It's 2026, and that means it's now 60 years since the first film version of Fahrenheit 451 was released. That was the version directed by Francois Truffaut, starring Oscar Werner and Julie Christie, and it was released in 1966 to a mixed response from critics. Ray himself, at the time, was very impressed with the film. He wrote a review of it for the Los Angeles Times, and he talked about Truffaut's visual poetry and said that what Truffaut had done is produce a film about a lover and a loved one. Man as lover, books as loved ones. And he also said that he and Francois Truffaut had shared out a folly with the story, and that, quote, their parallel loves had by an optical illusion somehow joined. So Ray was really very much in love with the movie. He saw it as being not a literal adaptation of the book, but a reflection of the book, and a reflection on the book. As the years went by, Ray began to get more critical of the film, and towards the end of his life, in the early 21st century, in interviews he was accusing Truffaut of ruining Fahrenheit 451. Now, I don't for 1 minute think that Truffaut ruined Fahrenheit 451. I don't think Ray really felt that either. I think that was old man Ray who had lived another few decades and suffered yet more frustrations at the hands of Hollywood, and was increasingly defensive of his own book, and increasingly critical of those who would adapt his book and do it badly. But I think he was misremembering his earlier love for Truffaut's film. Francois Truffaut was a French film director, originally a film critic. He began his career writing for Cahiers du Cinéma, the French film review magazine, and he became a filmmaker in the late 1950s. He had tremendous success with his early films The 400 Blows, Les 400 Coups in French, and Shoot the Piano Player. And he also had a tremendous success with the book that he co-wrote with Alfred Hitchcock. It was actually a collection of interviews with Hitchcock, where he sat down with Hitchcock for days on end, interviewing him about every film that Hitchcock had made in the order that they were released. And the book that was produced, the Hitch book, is a really very comprehensive book on filmmaking, focusing obviously on Hitchcock, but also revealing many things about Truffaut as a filmmaker. So the Hitch book in itself would have been a fantastic legacy for Truffaut, but the fact that he was a filmmaker and went on to win the Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film means that he really was an amazing filmmaker and an amazing film analyst and critic. Truffaut showed very little interest, however, in science fiction, so some people have been baffled as to why he was the director chosen to make Fahrenheit 451 in 1966. Well, in fact, it was nothing to do with science fiction. Truffaut was, first and foremost, a bibliophile. He was an absolute lover of literature. And when a friend of his introduced him to Fahrenheit 451 and told him that it's a book about books, Truffaut was intrigued, and he read the book and was very taken with the central metaphor of book burning and how destroying literacy destroys a civilization. Now, Truffaut wanted to make the film. He knew that Bradbury was a screenwriter. Ray had, by this time, already written Moby Dick. He'd already had a number of other film products made from his stories, and he was working on other film projects. So Truffaut's first instinct was to ask Ray. But at this point, and we're talking about early 60s, Ray was really very burned out on filmmaking generally. Okay, he'd had that success with Moby Dick, but he tried to follow that up with film projects with Burt Lancaster, with Carol Reed, the director of The Third Man, and he'd done some script doctoring for other projects where he wasn't credited. Plus, he'd spent a number of years trying to get The Martian Chronicles made, but the project stalled at the last hurdle. And so by the early 60s, Ray was a bit fed up with filmmaking and wanted to get back to his poetry, his plays, his short stories, and his books. Ray had already attempted to write a stage version of Fahrenheit 451 in the mid-1950s, hoping that his friend Charles Laughton would be able to either produce the play or perhaps even star in it. But unfortunately, Laughton was not very impressed with Ray's play script, and Ray left the project feeling a bit downhearted and thinking that maybe he was never going to be a successful playwright. So when the invitation came from Truffaut to write the screenplay for the film based on his own book, Ray declined. So Truffaut began writing himself with his colleague Jean-Louis Richard. His intention at this time was to make a French film. He was a French filmmaker. French was the only language he knew. All of his films had been made in French, and quite naturally he assumed that his next one would be as well. We can imagine this early version of Fahrenheit 451, if it had been brought to fruition, would probably have been a black and white film, because that's all that Truffaut had made up to this point. It would probably, and this is no joke, it would probably have starred Charles Aznavour as Montag. Aznavour was the star of Truffaut's film Shoot the Piano Player. Later in life, Aznavour would become known as a singer and as an all-round entertainer. But in the early 60s, he was a very good character actor. He would have made an interesting Montag. As time went on, and Truffaut developed the script further and tried to raise funding to make Fahrenheit, which he called, by the way, The Phoenix, Truffaut began to think about other casting possibilities, and one of the names that you'll see bandied about in accounts of Truffaut's life is Jean-Paul Belmondo, the famous French actor. Again, possibly a very interesting Montag, but it wasn't to be. The attempt to raise funding and support for the film didn't really go anywhere, so Truffaut put it on the back burner and went and made some other films instead. Meanwhile, Universal Pictures, the American film company, was trying to make inroads into European production. They set up a new production wing in England, and they were the ones who picked up on Truffaut's plan for Fahrenheit 451. It was seen as something that was potentially a successful international film product, something to be made by France's leading filmmaker, perhaps with a British or a European cast, but based on an American book, and therefore ticking all the boxes for an internationally successful film. And this also brought more money to Fahrenheit 451, and now new casting opportunities arose. For the first time, Truffaut began thinking about this as a film in English. He'd already written the script with Jean-Louis Richard, and the script was in French, so he got the script translated into English with the intention of shooting in England, in English, with an international cast. His plan for Montag, at this point, was to be the British actor Terence Stamp, and opposite him would be Julie Christie, another really big British name. Truffaut was having trouble casting the twin female lead roles. Montag's wife, in the book she's called Millie or Mildred, in the film she was to be called Linda, and Clarice, the young teenage girl who befriends Montag. Truffaut was having problems casting these two roles. He couldn't decide which was the more important. And then the American producer of the film, Lewis Allen, said, "Why don't you use Julie Christie for both roles? There presumably is something that these two women have in common, or else why would Montag be attracted to both of them? Why would Montag have married Linda and now be attracted to Clarice? Maybe they look alike. Maybe they should both be played by the same actor." So Lewis Allen's idea was, let's get Julie Christie to play both parts. In principle, that's an interesting idea, but in practice, I think many viewers find it baffling that Linda and Clarice look almost identical. The only thing that's different about them is their hairstyle, and yet A, no reference is ever made to this in the film, B, Montag clearly doesn't notice that they look the same, and C, in the film, as made, Montag isn't actually attracted to Clarice. It is, in fact, Clarice that pursues him. So the whole idea of the two women looking like each other, to suggest some commonality between them, becomes something of a lost idea in the film. I mean, it's there if you want to read something into it, but I think many viewers just come away baffled. Now, this dual casting also had consequences for the casting of Montag, because when Terence Stamp, leading British actor of the mid-1960s, gets wind of the fact that Julie Christie, leading British actress of the mid-60s, is going to have two roles in this film, he bows out. So we no longer have a Montag. So Truffaut is now stuck with another casting problem. Almost out of desperation, Truffaut turns to his friend and colleague from a previous film, Oskar Werner, the Austrian actor who had co-starred in Jules et Jim, which was probably Truffaut's biggest hit up to this point. It's a film about a ménage à trois, two men in love with the same woman, forming a happy-go-lucky trio of characters. By all accounts, Oskar Werner and Francois Truffaut got on really well making that film, but that relationship didn't hold while they were making Fahrenheit 451. I've never really understood why this is, but every account says that Oskar Werner really got too big for his boots. Being now the international film star, he didn't like being told what to do, and on a number of occasions in the shooting of Fahrenheit, Oskar Werner did things that would undermine his director. For example, one day he went out and got a haircut so that the continuity of the film would be destroyed. Sometimes on set he would be uncooperative and would refuse to do a scene the way that Truffaut had conceived it. There's a couple of hints to this in the finished film. There's a sequence where Montag for the first time dons all of his fireproof gear to burn some books. It's near the beginning of the film. And when you watch the film, the footage looks a bit strange. It looks like it's running backwards. Well, in fact, it is running backwards because Truffaut was faced with footage that didn't really work because Oskar Werner had performed it badly, deliberately ignoring the director's instructions. So the film editor said, how about we look at running the film backwards? Because possibly it might just look okay. So the editor ran the film backwards, and it does look weird. We see Montag putting on clothes in a very strange way. The clothes sort of fly onto him. But Truffaut quite liked the effect, so he used it in the film. The other hint that Oskar Werner's behaviour was not up to scratch is the fact that some of his lines are clearly dubbed. His performance was not considered to be quite right in a number of scenes, so Truffaut had no real alternative but to call him in and to get him to re-record the audio. Now, this isn't unheard of. It happens all the time in Hollywood films and in British films, and at that time, in much of Europe, in France and in Italy, it was common practice for nearly all dialogue scenes in films to be redubbed after the event, simply because many of the French and Italian film studios were in the middle of cities and would often pick up a lot of traffic noise and so on. So the dubbing would have seemed perfectly natural to Truffaut, but the viewer of the film is then faced with these scenes where Werner's voice somehow doesn't sound quite right. The acoustics don't match, the intensity of the performance doesn't quite match. The sum total of all these problems is that the viewer is aware of something being off, but without quite being able to pinpoint what it is that's off. Throughout the making of Fahrenheit 451, Truffaut kept a diary and he published it in Cahiers du Cinéma. And he's very frank and very open about some of these problems. He talks about them in real time. So it's quite an unusual situation that we have a kind of running commentary from the filmmaker himself. Okay, so the film is completed. It's released to mixed reviews in 1966. Ray loves it. He's not at all bothered that Truffaut has changed things from his book because he recognises that things must change. And in fact, Ray is so taken with what Truffaut has done that a couple of decades later, when Ray writes a new stage play version of Fahrenheit 451, he actually borrows a number of ideas from Truffaut's film. So Bradbury's novel inspires the film, and then the film inspires the play. Now, I don't want to give the wrong impression here. I don't want to give the impression that Ray adapted the film for the stage, because that's not what he did. He adapted his book for the stage, but he made significant changes, particularly to the characterization of Beatty, the fire chief. So the play does not match the book, but it is clearly a rewrite of the book. But in doing that rewriting, he also allowed himself to be open to ideas that Truffaut had brought in with the film version. Now, I wrote about this aspect of Ray's stage play writing in an article that I published in 2016. So that was for the 50th anniversary of the film, and now we're at the 60th anniversary. So I'm looking back 10 years now at an article that I wrote at the time. One of the observations I made at that point is that Ray was flattered by Truffaut's film. Ray had spent a number of years trying to get to work with the leading lights of Hollywood and of British cinema, and of world cinema, in fact. He'd already worked with John Huston on Moby Dick. He'd done considerable script work for Burt Lancaster and his company, which was called Hecht Hill Lancaster. He'd done some script writing for Carol Reed, the director of The Third Man, and he became good friends with the Italian filmmaker Federico Fellini. He'd also reached out to filmmakers like David Lean, the director of Lawrence of Arabia, and the Japanese director Akira Kurosawa. I'm not saying Ray was desperate to work with these people, but he clearly was trying to pitch himself as being on a similar level and get away from any association he may have with science fiction B pictures. Anyway, Truffaut, as it turned out, was the only major figure in world cinema who would adapt a Bradbury work during Bradbury's lifetime. Sure, Ray had worked with John Huston, who is a major figure in world cinema, but that wasn't on a Bradbury project, that was on Herman Melville's Moby Dick. There's another strand to this, and that's that during the 1960s and beyond, Ray was very keen on seeing all the best films from around the world, and in fact he helped set up a film screening society for the Writers Guild in Hollywood, so that American screenwriters would be exposed not just to American films, but to the best films from around the world. So Ray was very familiar with the best work that was being produced out there. And indeed, in 1962, he watched Jules et Jim, the critically acclaimed film by Truffaut that I mentioned earlier, the Truffaut film that had starred Oscar Werner. And when Ray saw this film, he wrote to Truffaut, and he said, "You were born to make motion pictures. A beautiful film of such texture and humanity, I simply am spelled by it." And Ray's first reaction to seeing Fahrenheit 451 on the big screen was, and I quote, "My novel looks at your picture and sees itself. Your picture looks at my novel and sees itself." Ray wrote that in a telegram that he sent to Truffaut immediately after he'd seen the film. After that, Ray wrote a letter to Truffaut, and he went into more detail of what he thought was great about the film. He referred to the film sets and said they were absolutely right, and so were the costumes. He was pleased with Julie Christie, who he said was beautiful in her double roles, and he was pleased with Oscar Werner, and his only criticism of the film was that he thought that it was too easy for Montag to escape from the city. And what he wrote to Truffaut is that we need a longer period of tension in the running chase before the lovely quiet period at the very end, which is just right. So Ray really loved the ending of the film, when Montag makes it to the forest and meets all the book people, and the snows begin, and the film ends in a very beautiful way. Okay, so Ray had attempted to write a play of Fahrenheit 451 in the 1950s. He didn't consider it to be a successful piece of writing. I think his general observation from it was that he had tried to be too literal to the book. In the early 1980s, he came out with a new version of Fahrenheit 451 as a stage play, and this was published as a text in 1986, although it was performed before that. This version of the play follows more or less the same story as the original book, but inevitably some scenes are truncated, some scenes are removed, and there are some new scenes inserted. And most significantly, there are several new aspects, principally around the character of Beatty, who is kind of redeemed in the play version. If you ever get to see the play, watch out for the way Ray treats Beatty. He doesn't just present him as an ogre. He tries to dig into how it was that Beatty ever became this way. Now, I said that Ray borrowed a number of elements from Truffaut's film and put them into the play, so let's go through some of those now. Perhaps the most striking visual element is in the film, where Montag uses the TV screen as a reading light. Now, it's already established in the film that the Montags have this giant TV screen. I mean, it's not that big. It's probably about a 65-inch TV. By today's standards, that's nothing. But in 1966, that was way bigger than any TV anybody had in their home. So viewers watching the film in 1966 would have been impressed by the Montag family's TV. Anyway, Montag, of course, comes to despise the TV. He has no use for it. It's his wife's plaything. She uses it to interact with these soap operas, TV dramas. Montag has no interest in any of that. And so the only time we ever see him making use of the TV is when he decides that he's going to break the law. He's going to read a book. He's stolen a book, the books that he's supposed to burn, and he's going to read one of these books. He gets up in the middle of the night, he turns on the TV and uses the glow of the TV screen as his reading light. So what does Bradbury do? Bradbury does the same thing. In the play, the stage directions say, Montag goes to turn on the TV screen to no particular station, to a station gone off for the night. So he is absolutely echoing the idea from Truffaut's film that the TV has no content to offer. Now, immediately following from that, we get to Montag's first act of reading, the first time we've ever seen him read. Now, in Ray's novel, what Montag does is reads a satirical passage from Jonathan Swift, and there's no way that Montag would have any of the context to understand what Swift is talking about. So it's a meaningful text in its own terms, but it's meaningless to Montag. What Truffaut does in the film is takes away the Jonathan Swift, and instead he uses a Dickens text to reflect Montag's situation. It's the opening chapter of David Copperfield. It's the I Am Born section. So Bradbury likes this idea, but he doesn't use David Copperfield. He does use Dickens, however. He uses A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Again, a very interesting text to be Montag's first text. And then something else that Bradbury borrows from the film is the way that Montag reads. In the film, we see Montag reading every single word in the book, even the name of the publisher, the copyright details, all of that. Because to Montag, it's all text, it's all forbidden, he's had no experience of any of it, so he savours every last bit, even the bits that are nonsensical to him. One of the most memorable scenes in the film comes towards the end when we're in the forest and we see a dying old man teaching a young boy a text. So we might wonder how it is that the book people learn their books. Well, we see it happening. We see a young boy memorizing the text, making an occasional mistake and then being corrected by the old man. This sequence is in part memorable because of the snowy setting of these scenes. We see the boy and the man, first of all, in a non-snowy setting, and then we see the snow falling and the same scene, but now all covered in snow. And this was Truffaut taking advantage of a very unlikely turn in the British weather. He filmed this section in April, and we do sometimes have snow in April in the UK, but not very often. But this year was exceptional, and there was snow. There was heavy snow. And rather than just abandon any idea of shooting, Truffaut decided to incorporate it into the film. He modified the dialogue to suit the weather, so the lines that are being memorized by the boy refer to the first snows of winter. In fact, in Truffaut's original script, the boy would have been learning Robert Louis Stevenson's The Master of Ballantrae. But when the snow began, he decided to improvise and change the quote to Weir of Hermiston. But what I've always found peculiar is that some of the lines in the film are not actually in Weir of Hermiston. And I've never gotten to the bottom of how it is that Truffaut put some made-up lines into the boy's dialogue. The specific line in question is, "And he died as he thought he would, as the first snows of winter fell." Now, if you go online and find a full-text edition of Weir of Hermiston, and it's out there because it's long out of copyright, so you'll find it online, do a search and you will not find that line anywhere in Weir of Hermiston. It appears to have been made up by Truffaut specifically for the film. But since the purpose of the scene is to have the boy learning the text, I've always been rather confused as to what it is the boy is learning. He is not learning the text. He's learning some made-up text. Anyway, Ray was so taken with this scene that he includes it in his play. He includes that same line of dialogue, "And he died as he thought he would, as the first snows of winter fell." That line is in Bradbury's play. That line is taken from Truffaut's film, where it purports to be Weir of Hermiston, but it is not Weir of Hermiston. It's made up. So there's a couple of things there that Ray borrowed from the film, and he never particularly talked about this, never wrote about this, but there were some other changes that he made for the play that he did talk about. And the main one of these is about the survival of Clarice. Now, in the novel, Clarice just disappears. We assume that she's been taken by the authorities. We assume that she's dead. She never comes back. But in the film, she comes back. She escapes. She escapes to the forest. She joins the book people around about the same time that Montag does. And in fact, we see a couple of shots in the film where they sort of walk past each other but don't notice each other. It's a very engaging little moment in the film as you realise that, they're nearly with each other, but they're not with each other. And then eventually they do meet up and we see them having a conversation. Ray really liked this idea of Clarice surviving. He wrote, "Many readers have written protesting Clarice's disappearance, wondering what happened to her. Truffaut felt the same curiosity and rescued her from oblivion. I felt the same need to save her. And so Clarice, presumed dead in the book, is brought back at the end of the play." 10 years ago, when I was writing about these changes that Ray made to his own work when writing it up as a play, I concluded that the play is Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, but at the same time, it isn't. It's not a simple translation of the novel. It's not just an innocent updating of the story. And it's not an attempt to fix whatever may be wrong with the novel. It in fact is a new work which is in dialogue with the original work and is in dialogue with the film. So I like to see these as being three works in conversation with each other. The book informs the film, the book informs the play, the film informs the play. And then the icing on the cake is that in the 1990s, Ray wrote a new screenplay for Fahrenheit 451. It was never filmed, but the screenplay survives. A 1994 version of it was published actually a couple of years ago. You can find it in the book Phoenix 451, which was edited by Elizabeth Nahum Albright, who I had as a guest on the podcast in the early days of the show. And that was published by Gauntlet Press in 2022. It's an unusual book because it's entirely TypeScript. It's got Ray's original TypeScript for Fahrenheit 451, the novel. It's got original TypeScripts of 2 stage versions of the story. And it's got the 1994 text for the screenplay. Now, Ray carried on working on the screenplay, and the most recent manuscript I've seen for it dates from 1997. So he was still working on it 3 years on from the one that's been published. But if you ever get a chance to lay hands on Phoenix 451, take a look and see what you think of the screenplay in there. I think it's one of Ray's better screenplays. But not only is it a retelling of his book, it's a retelling of his play, and therefore, in parts, it's a retelling of Truffaut's version of the story. So, although we never got to see the film of Fahrenheit 451 written in 1997, the screenplay kind of captures all of this stuff in one new and quite exciting retelling of the story. So here we are, 60 years on from the Francois Truffaut film of Fahrenheit 451. It's far from a perfect film, but it's still very watchable. But it is very much of the 60s. Its look and its feel is very much of that time. And of course, some of the technology now looks outdated. So as I mentioned before, the very large television owned by the Montags just doesn't look very large by modern standards, and you wonder what all the fuss is about. But nevertheless, on a dramatic level, it's an interesting reimagining of Bradbury's story. So if you've never seen Fahrenheit 451 from 1966, go out now, find it on DVD or Blu-ray, and you may be surprised. That's it for now. I'll see you next time on Bradbury 100. Bradbury 100 is presented and produced by Phil Nichols. Music is provided by Purple Planet at purpleplanet.com. Please subscribe using your podcast app. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all good podcast places. And please also check out my YouTube series, Bradbury 101, and my other audio podcast, Science Fiction 101. For information on all of these, head to bradburymedia.co.uk.